Hi, and welcome to the Three Principles Global Community webinar. The Three Principles Global Community, also known as 3PGC, is a nonprofit organization that's committed to bringing an understanding of the Three Principles to people throughout the world. You can learn more about the Three Principles Global Community at 3pgc.org. Today we have with us George Pransky. Dr. George Pransky is one of the two professional founders of the Understanding of the Principles of Mind, Thought, and Consciousness. He has taught the principles for over 30 years to individuals, couples, businesses, and colleagues. Dr. Pransky is the author of the Relationship Handbook and over 50 audio recordings. During his career, he served on the faculty of 3 graduate universities and continues to pioneer his understanding in new industries. Currently, he's a partner at Pransky & Associates and on the executive committee of the Three Principles Global Community. And before I turn it over to you, George, I want to say to everyone who's joining us on Google Hangouts, if you are on Google Hangouts, there is a Q&A box on the right-hand side, and if you have any questions for George during this webinar, you can type them in and he'll be able to answer them. So George, viewers are coming on now, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well thank you, Bonnie, for that nice introduction. I love doing the webinar for the Three Principles Global Community. I think it's wonderful that we're providing an ongoing webinar series, because it's just a chance for people to connect into it's like a continuing education program. So, Bonnie, do you think I should get started right now? This is probably good.
Yes, and it looks like someone is already asking a question. I don't know if you want to start with that or if you want to begin with your talk.
Well, I'll check it out and see what the question is. I'll put my glasses on and everything. Okay. Well, I will get to these questions as we go along. This is a very different thing that I'm doing this webinar, because up to, let's say, a year ago in my career, my efforts were in helping individuals, couples, organizations, businesses. I did mediation. I used the principles in a wide range of applications. But I never had the occasion to look at the principles in terms of helping the world or engaging in a world problem or in a societal problem. So it's something I just never crossed my path as a private practitioner. But the occasion did cross my path, because a person who was interested in the principles and very involved in the principles, her husband was worked for the United Nations, solving problems throughout the world. I didn't even know that the United Nations had many people in different countries trying to help those countries with the societal problems that they have. So she suggested to her husband, who was involved in a project in Kenya, eliminating corruption in the Kenyan police force, she mentioned to him that while he was interviewing people to be the main consultant, that maybe he should interview someone from the Three Principles community, because that's the orientation that she had. She was already a competent teacher, and she loved the principles. She went to conferences. She did the Insight course that we did. And he said, "Well, I'll interview him." You know, he wasn't really into the principles, and he told me it was a slightly not an irritant, but he was a little turned off by it. You know how when people get into principles, we drive everybody crazy with wanting them to get involved in it. So he wasn't put off, but he just felt like, well, that's not really my thing. I'm not interested. But he was looking for a consultant, and he thought, well, maybe if I interview someone from the community, uh, they'd be, they might be the person that does this job. So she suggested me mostly because of my business experience, how long I've been involved in this, and uh, and he interviewed me, and he told me about the reform efforts that they were doing in Kenya, and it was kind of a model of reform efforts throughout the world. And what they'd done so far is they had uh, restructured the police service. So they made a lot of structural changes as to who reports to who, and they changed the names of the designated leaders in it, and they restructured the whole police service, and they spent quite a long time figuring that out and getting it just the way they wanted it. And then the second thing they did is they did procedural changes. So they put in new procedures. They changed ones that they had. They put in lines of accountability and oversight. So they had a 300-page manual of changes, and they had a new organizational chart. And then their plan was to take the procedural manual, and they had these facilitators that had volunteered. They had like 25 facilitators, and they were going to take the manual and they were going to go out in the police community and educate people about the new coin of the realm, if you will, the new reforms and the new way they were going to do things. And that was their program. So that's where they were so far. And he was looking for people that would train the facilitators in communication skills so that they could get these ideas and these new ideas across to people better. So that's what he presented to me. And he said, do you have any thoughts on that, George? And if you were involved, if you were a consultant, what would you contribute to our efforts? Well, coming from the principles, my orientation, just as yours is that everything has to be from the inside out, that there has to be something that happens inside the people in the police force for any reform to take place. So I tried to explain that to him, and he didn't understand it very well. So I said, well, specifically, one thing you have to do is get people to think this is a great idea. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is, this is a fantastic idea, as a person in the police force, I am totally behind it. And a 1 would be, I have no interest whatsoever in this reform. Okay? And I suggested to him that any reform, but this one particularly, is not going to be naturally very high up on there, because the people in the police force who are taking bribes and who are a part of the corruption are going to see it as a bad thing that corruption is eliminated. It would be like going to the food industry and taking away tips. It was built into their standard of living. It was built into their way of life. So they're not going to put that up at a 10, because let's get behind this reform to get rid of corruption in the country. So that was one thing that I said was missing from their program. And I asked him how they accounted for that, and he said that Well, that's why they had the facilitation training, that they were going to kind of sell the idea as a greater good, get people to see that this would be good for the world and uh, good for Kenya, and it would set an example for other countries. And I suggested to him that when people are insecure and involved in, you know, involved in corruption and their heads aren't in a great place, they're going to be more concerned about their own personal perceived needs than they are greater good. So I didn't see a greater good argument going very far. So the other thing I told him was that there are certain human skills involved in the reforms that they're doing that had to be developed in people. So, for example, they wanted to do community policing instead of having policemen, drive around, sit in the headquarters and wait for crimes to be reported and then go out and deal with them. They wanted the policemen out in the community, interfacing with the community, because it's a source of information. So if you're out in the community, you begin to understand where where the crime is coming from, and you get advance notice and you get sources. So it's like an intelligence. You've put in an intelligence program if you have community policing. And they also knew that there was a really bad rapport between police and the community. Very bad. They had riots and they had 1,000 deaths after the last election, and the police were implicated as exacerbating things, as contributing negatively to it. So there was a bad rapport between the police and the public, and the idea was that community policing would change all that. It would create a good rapport. So I said to Simon, who was the UN representative, I said, well, Simon, there's an ability for people to have rapport, to create rapport, to create rapport in the face of resistance. So you have these police officers with a public that has a bad attitude towards them. They have to have pretty good rapport skills to not react to that and to get in a good feeling with the public. And I asked him if that was part of the program. He said, well, it isn't. I didn't even know that could be done. I mean, I know we've tried to do certain skills throughout my career with United Nations. We've had skill training, but I haven't seen the skill training really create the kind of rapport and kind of skills that you're talking about. I've always been disappointed in the techniques because they don't seem to work for the people that need them, and the people that are really good that could use the techniques don't need them. So so that was on that basis that I got considered to work for the UN. Now, what I've said so far to me is kind of the minor points. They're the points that we all probably have thought of if we'd been, confronted with the situation. But the deeper point, and the point that I'd like to focus on in this webinar, is I had to ask myself, what potential is there in human beings that would eliminate corruption? In other words, if it's an inside-out existence as a human being, what do humans have going for them that would eliminate corruption? Where is that change or shift going to come from in human beings? And as I reflected on it, I realized that if you raise people's level of understanding so that they see life with more wisdom and more uh, understanding of what it is to be a human being, which we call, what Sid Banks used to call raising a person's level of consciousness. If you raise a person's level of understanding, level of wisdom, level of consciousness, I mean those to be synonymous. All boats rise with the tide. So any given person that had a moment of truth and their level of understanding came up, they grasped the principles and it raised their level, would find that their sense of humor got better, they thought with more clarity, they felt more connected to other people, they would be more compassionate, they would be more resilient, they'd get over things faster, they would be less caught up in their thinking. Every human quality that they had would essentially be improved. That's just how levels of consciousness work. All boats rise with the tide. So if you get 30 people and all of them had a raised consciousness, you would notice all these things improve in all 30 of those people. And it would improve to the extent, to the degree that their level went up. So for some people, it would be great enhancement in each of those things, and some people it would be a lesser enhancement. Okay? Well, one of the boats that rises with the tide is conscience. Everybody's conscience gets stronger and louder when their level goes up. So if you're living your life and suddenly you have an insight about the nature of life and insight into the principles and your level goes up, I can guarantee you that some things that you did that you thought were just fine will come to mind and you'll say, gee, that wasn't really right what I did. I owe that person an apology, or I need to learn from that. So maybe you didn't treat your coworker right. You didn't even notice it at the time because you were living in a different level of functioning. Okay? Now, at this higher level of functioning, the way you talk to your coworker doesn't set right with you. Okay? So that's an example. That's how conscience gets louder. Now, if you take a corrupt police force and you raise the level of consciousness within the individuals in the police force, and the level goes up, not only will their conscience go up and make it more difficult for them to do corrupt activities, but their level of compassion would go up, and they would be affected by the distress that they were causing to the people that they were taking money from. So if they were pulling over a car in order to exact money from the driver, they looked in the car and they saw the family in the car and their level of compassion was higher, it would be more meaningful to them. They would see the humanity in the people and they would be compassionate of, gee, this family has to support itself. Well, it's going to be harder for them if I take money out of their pockets. And that compassion would undercut the tendency for corruption. Conscience would undercut the tendency for corruption. So if the level of consciousness went up in the individuals in the Kenyan police force, there would be a lot of factors changes in their personalities and the way they were as people that would undercut the tendency for corruption. So it's the answer to the corruption problem is there in the individual and in the consciousness, not in the individual himself, but in the consciousness of the individual. So as the consciousness of the person goes up, the solution to corruption appears and gets stronger. See? Now, the other good news about this as a solution is that if I was hired to go into Kenya and the name of the program was Eliminating Corruption, it would not be a very popular program. Because, as I say, people would see it as against their best interest. But if my objective is to help the people to raise their level of consciousness so that they can have nicer lives and nicer family lives and enjoy life more and contribute more to society, so all I'm interested in is raising their level of consciousness, I don't have to call it eliminating corruption. I can call it eliminating stress. I can call it having more well-being. I can call it having a nicer family life. I can call it getting along better with others. I can call it improving your golf game. I can call it getting along better with your kids. In other words, I can call the program anything and still teach the same thing. Teach the principles and still have the same objective to help people to raise their level of understanding. So when I talk to the Kenyan higher-ups about is, let's call it a stress course, because they all admitted that the police talked about post-traumatic stress, the stress in their relationship with the public, their stress in their relationship with their colleagues, stress in their relationship with the higher-ups. So there's stress in 360 degrees in all directions. And the police force, the police service personnel didn't want to have that stress. They didn't want to have it in their families. They didn't want to have it in their jobs. So that if we offered a course on stress, it would be higher up on that scale of 1 to 10. So the anti-corruption course would be very low on the scale, and a stress and well-being course would be very high, because they would see that as in their best interest. You see? And that would work for someone teaching the principles, because that's as good a metaphor as any. And you could honestly sit down with a person in the police force, in the police service, and honestly say to them, look, I have your interests at heart. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to help you to have a nicer life and a nicer situation. And you could mean it, and they could tell that you meant it because they could see it in your eyes. And then you would have them high on that scale. And when their level of consciousness went up, all the skills that were needed, like, for instance, the skills needed for community policing, rapport skills, that would all be built into the all boats rise with the tide. So as they became more secure and more connected, which is what happens when the level goes up, their rapport skills would be better. They wouldn't have to do any techniques. They would just feel better about other people, feel less threatened, feel more connected, more warmly. And that's what the improves rapport, is having a more warm human feeling, and that would be part of the package, you might say. So, in short, my interface with the United Nations really brought me back to the drawing board and realizing just how powerful and all-inclusive this understanding of principles is. That I saw clearly how it would provide solutions to global and societal difficulties and problems, where now there's a real struggle. I mean, it would take you a long time to list the societal problems that are common to all societies, and they don't seem to have answers. But the principles provide an answer to all of them, and that was very did a lot for me to see that. And just as a side note, my wife Linda, myself, and Aaron Turner and Mara Gleason and Eric from Norway, we're all doing a conference in Norway, an outward-facing conference about how the principles can help world problems. And it came out of us understanding that everything comes from within people. And the principles is the answer to all human matters. As people understand the principles and their level goes up, all boats rise with the tide, and all human problems get lessened. You can see that, like during 9/11 even. People kind of had a moment of truth about, feeling, compassionate towards others, and how, life can change in a second, and crime rate went down, everything. Society suddenly improved, okay, for a period of time. But there wasn't a foundation of understanding that the principles bring to it, so it came and went. And through the course of human history, that's been the case. It happened in the Renaissance. But the principles have provided a foundation. They provided an answer to the question, how did that come about? And what's behind experiences of higher understanding, higher consciousness? Well, I think I'm going to check, put my glasses on, and check and see what kind of questions we have. So I know this is a little bit different than the kind of presentations we usually have.
George, something hit me as you were talking, in that in this environment of corruption that it sounds like it's very ingrained in that police force, and probably in many other levels of different governments, that as this understanding and as their consciousness rises because of it, the thoughts of corruption are still probably going to come because it's been a habitual thing in their community. But the understanding that their thoughts are just something that will pass and they don't have to act on it is another maybe a piece of the sustainable understanding that perhaps wasn't there when 9/11 happened. Everybody's feeling of camaraderie went up, but then as thought took over and people were caught up in their thought again, the base understanding that it's just thought wasn't there, whereas the three principles adds that level of grounding.
It does, and the other thing it does, Bonnie, and this is the answer to a question that's come up, is the three principles do not. In other words, when you understand the principles at a deeper level, it helps you even as your thinking remains the same. That's the beauty of it. Like most every other approach I know that has to do with thought, like cognitive therapy or reframing or positive thinking, is built on the premise that you have to change your thinking in order to have a nicer life. And the principles do not require people to change their thinking in order to have a nicer life, even though their thinking will change in a positive way automatically. Your relationship to your thinking changes. So as you suggested, a person can still have thoughts about, gee, it'd be really easy to pull someone over and get some money, and I have my own financial problems, and I'm under a lot of pressure, and I have to do something about that. So people will still have that, still have those thoughts, but they don't. As if their level of understanding goes up, those thoughts will not be as loud. They'll feel easier to just ignore them, and it'll happen just naturally. Like I know for myself, just using me as an example, I can ruminate on very minor things. Like I don't have a problem, taking my family across the country and moving to California, or dropping a very successful practice and getting involved in the principles. It's always been easy for me to, to boldly, jump into things. But I get ruminating about little things like, when should I do my exercise this afternoon? And I'll get, I mean, even though it sounds crazy, I'll get really serious about it. I'll say, well, should I do it right after I eat? Maybe I should. And throughout the course of a day, there are things that are very, very, other people will consider very petty, and I'll get wrapped up in overthinking them and analyzing them. Okay, now, what's changed as I've understood more and learned more is it used to be in my face, and then it got more to the side, and then got more to the side, and because it looks like thought at the time. It looks like thought sooner. And once it looks like thought, it doesn't have the hold or the credibility in me. And therefore it's like background noise. And that does not interfere with me, with my life. And then it hangs around for a while and then it goes away. But I think that's the potential. I think that one of the hardest things for human beings is is understanding that we are not capable of thinking our way out of the thoughts we're caught up in. I know Albert Einstein made a beautiful statement. He said, you can never solve a problem at the level at which the problem was created. And as we as human beings get caught up in our thinking, we have to remember that the same mind, the same level that created that thinking is now trying to solve it. So, like in the Kenya situation, the kind of thinking that's based on people meeting their needs and feeling deprived and feeling like they have to, it's either them or me. That kind of thinking, when their level of consciousness goes up, that thinking won't look as sound to them. It just won't. They still can relate to it, and they can relate to other people having that. But for them, it just wouldn't look as sound as they change their relationship to the thinking. So the relationship to their own needs, wants, and desires would change, and that change would be the basis of what we're calling a reform. Well, Bonnie, I think I'm going to look at some of the questions here. It says, what you're talking about today seems to involve direct face-to-face interaction between people. How does what you're saying apply when it's not the case, for instance, to politicians or hedge fund managers where individuals are an abstraction? Well, you see, if you get a hedge fund manager or a politician and they have let's say they get an understanding of the principles and what's behind life, the nature of life, and let's say that their level of understanding goes up, that will affect everything they see and everything they do. That's what I mean by all boats rise with the tide. So the world that they see will change, because when we're at a higher level of functioning, we think different and we see different. And the world that they see will be a world that's, nicer, wiser. They'll see more goodwill in people. They'll see an opportunity for them to have more calm and peace in their lives. So that when they go to work the next day as a politician or as a hedge manager, they see in a kinder, more generous way. And that's what makes them, characterizes them as a nicer human being. So it's always has to come from inside the person. Will the work ultimately be researched in the UN? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I actually have an answer to that. Uh, I've talked to the UN and I've talked to the Kenyan police officials about doing a documentary, and we're in the process of talking about that. And I have someone who from London who was a woman who was ahead of the documentaries for the major one of the major channels over there, and she's offered to help. So as we speak, we're putting together a proposal. So even though we don't have a we don't have a research plan, we are going to see if we can film it and make a documentary out of it, because there's a lot of interest, as you can imagine, in the world about ending corruption, and there hasn't been a good pilot. There hasn't been a program that's proved successful. So we're hoping that if we document this and it works out well, it will provide a template for other countries. And the UN is very, very, very interested in this. So as we're doing it, there's more and more people that are saying, what are you doing? How are you doing that? How are you going about it? So that's our hope, that we get a documentary out and people can, and it can provide hope and possibility for other countries. Like Sweden was the one that is the country that is funding the Kenyan police reform. And this very wonderful woman from Sweden, who's part of the Sweden embassy, was over in Kenya when I was there and went to some of the things I did, and we spent time talking, and she saw the implications for the educational system in Sweden and for the prison system in Kenya, just listening to the presentations to the police. So she's seeing other ways that the principles could help on a societal level. Well, I'm getting messages from people about how the principles have helped them with very serious illnesses, and the beauty of it is that any human being has an immediate capability of having a rise in their level of understanding. And when that happens, it doesn't matter how severe the symptoms are or how long they've had the symptoms. So we all stand at the same level of hope and possibility in that regard. So when I was seeing people clinically, when I do see people one-on-one, I don't even ask them how long they've been feeling the way they've been feeling. Because at any moment, if they get that realization of the nature of the human experience and the role of thought and the intelligence behind life, that's like a fresh start. That what's happened up to then will not matter to them anymore. It'll just be like waking up from a bad dream, from a nightmare. Uh, so here's someone says, I get trapped in the seduction of my own thinking. I can literally think all day and do nothing physical. This overthinking has been going on since 7 years ago. Uh, could you please comment on this? Gee, there's really no answer other than to uh, have a, a momentary realization about the nature of the human experience, the nature of the principles. So you can't really uh, you can't find an answer by looking at what your thinking is or how you're going about it. The answer has to come from seeing the nature of thought. And in order to see the nature of thought, as a human being, you have to step back and to a philosophical level and have a realization about what thought is and what its nature is and where it comes from. In my own personal world, in my own personal experience, I had the realization that thought was like there was a thin line between thought and imagination. So at one point I experienced thought as imagination. And it really helped me. It was harder for me to take it as seriously. And since that moment of realization, it's had that kind of more of an ethereal quality to it. It just hasn't felt as heavy and as substantial. Now that was, again, an across the board. It just seemed like life wasn't as real as I thought it was. And I had that the very first time I met Sydney Banks. That was the realization that George Pransky had. I saw that my life as I saw it was not as real as it appeared to be. Now that alone made a huge difference on a go-forward basis for the rest of my life. So all it takes is one insight, and your relationship to your thinking changes. See, I like these questions. Uh, yeah, someone said that the documentary is a wonderful thing. Thrilled to hear that the UN does a huge amount of research that is the basis for a lot of international policy decisions. It'd be wonderful if you would research this as well, and that's possible. I'm a little new to this. All of this just, I mean, my first trip to Kenya was about a month ago, so it may be that there's all kinds of research opportunities that I'm not aware of, but it certainly be something that I would pursue because. I really think that this is going to work out if we can do courses on stress and on uh, you know, getting along with other people, courses like that as a way of raising people's level of understanding, I can see that changing hearts and minds. And I can see that as creating a momentum towards a more high-minded police service. And the thing is, community policing would feel good to the policeman and feel good to the public. So I think it will take on a life of its own. And if there was research that shows that that was the case, I think that would be excellent. And it is something that, you know, I'll be looking into. Well, I've answered most of the questions that come up. Someone asked, what name have you given to the initiative in Kenya? What is it called? Well, that's up for consideration right now. The stage I'm in right now is I'm going over there to work with the county commanders. There's 150 county commanders, and we're going to do a pilot project with 20 of them. And we're just working on what we're going to call it and how we're going to present it to the county commanders. So that's and that'll be happening in the next couple of months. As I said earlier, I'd like it to be just a course to help the police service with stress. That would really be good. In my mind, that would be a good way to do it. But I have to talk with the Minister of Reforms and the Inspector General. Those are the people that make those decisions. So Simon, my UN boss, and I will be, you know, trying to work that out with them. You know, someone made the comment that they benefited from cognitive behavioral therapy, and it was more helpful than the medication that they were taking. And I think that anybody, no matter what the approach is, any approach that points to the possibility that thought has something to do with our experience of life is going to get people looking in that direction. And when they look in that direction, they will see the relationship between thought and experience. So there's a way in which therapies work, no matter what the therapy is, to the extent that they pull people back and let people see the nature of life from a little bit of distance. And if a therapy doesn't do that, it's not going to help the person at all. And if it does that, just doing that is helpful. Now, I saw some research that was very interesting. They had I think 7 different approaches, and they researched the efficacy of the approaches, how effective they were. And as a control group, they used the waiting list of those therapists. So they pre and post tested the people who went to the therapist during the research, and they pre and post tested the waiting list during that period of time. And the people on the waiting list showed gains in their mental health. So they didn't go through therapy, but they showed gains in the mental health. And you say, well, why would they show any gains at all? They were just on the waiting list. They were waiting to be treated. Why would their mental health improve? Well, that illustrates the point that I was making. The very fact that they're looking in the direction of understanding how they can improve their well-being, and looking at the possibility that they could learn something that could help them, points people in an internal direction and gives them some distance from themselves, and that improves their mental health. And in many instances, the waiting list people improve more than the people that are actually treated. So when human beings are focused inside, they make progress. Well, I think that's about it, Bonnie. I think we're moving towards the end of our time. I did want to, I know you were going to point this out too, but I did want to remind people about the conference next fall of the Three Principles Global Community. And, you know, I'll be there. I'll be talking at the conference, and the level of talent at that conference is really a wonderful thing. I mean, they have the best speakers in terms of the principles coming there, and they're going to have different tracks according to what people's interests are. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, George. Me too. And for anyone who's interested, the conference is October 27th through the 30th. And you can learn more about that at 3principlesconference.org. 3 is spelled out. And I believe I put that link on the bottom of the description of this event. And I just want to say the next webinar is, see real quick, the next is May 12th with Ed Lemon, and then we have Mara Gleason on May 24th. So please join us again for those 2 3PGC webinars. And one more thing, George, I just thought I'd mention, since you brought up the One Solutions Conference, while you were talking, I looked up the website for that. If anyone wants to learn more about that conference, it's onesolutionevent.com, one spelled out, O-N-E. So I can't thank you enough. This was extremely inspiring and insightful, and really appreciate you taking your time to join us on this webinar.
Well, it's my pleasure, Bonnie. I really like doing it. I love the Three Principles Global Community. I love the way it's creating a network and a continuing education program, and doing the conferences. So it's just my pleasure to be a part of it in this way.
Great, thank you, and we'll see you all again either virtually or hopefully at the conference live.
Okay.